Before a single bullet tore through a human torso in August 1914, the global financial system had already suffered a fatal, systemic cardiac arrest. On July 31st, 4 days before Great Britain declared war on Germany, the London Stock Exchange slammed its doors shut. It was not a temporary suspension. It was the first time the financial capital of the world had ceased trading in its entire 116-year history. Within 48 hours, every major bourses from Berlin to Paris, from St. Petersburg to New York, went completely dark. International bill clearing houses froze overnight. The gold standard, hailed for half a century as the immutable foundation of global civilization, vanished in a single afternoon as panicked citizens laid siege to central bank vaults. We were taught that a prince's death started the fire. But no one asks who drenched the continent in gasoline. For over a century, court historians have sold you a comforting fairy tale of tragic miscalculations, Serbian assassins, and entangling alliances. You were told that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914, setting off an unstoppable domino effect of diplomatic hubris. You were told that Europe somehow slid into war, as if an entire continent of industrial powers accidentally stumbled into a meat grinder that claimed 20 million lives. It is a convenient fiction. It absolves the financial architects of responsibility and reduces a cold, structural economic collapse to a tragic emotional mistake. The official story says Sarajevo was the spark that ignited hypernationalism. The reality is far more disturbing. The July crisis was not an emotional diplomatic escalation, it was a public-facing smokescreen designed to hide a systemic insolvency crisis tearing through European balance sheets. What historians get wrong is mistaking the public theatrical triggers for the underlying economic drivers. The alliances that dragged Europe into battle, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, were not solemn pacts of honor or cultural brotherhood. They were joint venture credit facilities, cross-collateralized bond cartels, and enforcement mechanisms for sovereign debt collection. The real cause they don't teach you in school starts not with gunpowder, but with compound interest. To find the real architects of 1914, you don't look at military high commands, you follow the debt. In 1871, following the Franco-Prussian War, the world adopted a monetary rulebook that made a global explosion not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. That rulebook was the classical gold standard. Under this system, every major paper currency was pegged directly to a fixed weight of physical gold. On paper, it was marketed as a miracle of monetary stability. In practice, it was a brutal, deflationary straitjacket managed by a single sovereign monopolist, the Bank of England. Because London controlled the world's primary clearinghouse for international trade in gold settlements, every industrializing power had to play by British rules. Here is the economic trap that standard history books ignore. Under the gold standard, a nation could only expand its domestic money supply, fund infrastructure, and support growing populations if it continually accumulated physical gold reserves. How did a nation acquire gold? By maintaining a permanent export surplus, selling more physical goods abroad than it imported. This created a mathematical paradox. It was physically impossible for every nation to run a trade surplus simultaneously. International trade became a zero-sum game of monetary survival. If your empire ran a trade deficit, gold bled out of your central bank vaults. To stop the outflow, your central bank had to raise interest rates, crashing domestic wages, bankrupting local businesses, and triggering massive social unrest among the industrial working class. By the late 1890s, a new industrial titan had emerged that threatened to break Britain's monetary monopoly entirely, the German Empire. Following its unification, Germany's steel production soared, its chemical industry surpassed all global competitors, and its advanced manufacturing began dominating European markets. German exports surged, threatening the revenue streams that serviced Britain's massive international debt ledger. The Bank of England watched in horror as gold flows began shifting eastward toward Berlin. The British elite realized that if Germany continued its industrial dominance for another decade, the financial center of gravity would permanently relocate from Threadneedle Street to the Reichsbank. As the global economic pie stopped growing, the only way for imperial powers to avoid domestic bankruptcy was to strip their neighbors of theirs. Long before dreadnought battleships lined up in the North Sea, a quiet war of trade tariffs was systematically destroying Europe's balance of trade. When domestic markets saturated in the late 1880s, global powers didn't embrace open competition, they erected defensive protectionist walls. The United States passed the brutal McKinley Tariff of 1890, locking European manufacturers out of American markets. Continental Europe responded in kind, slapping punitive tariffs on imported industrial goods and raw commodities. Britain, desperate to protect its domestic producers from superior German engineering, passed the Merchandise Marks Act of 1887. The law mandated that all foreign goods sold in the United Kingdom had to carry a label stating their country of origin. The British government assumed that patriotic consumers would refuse to buy foreign products, effectively crushing German imports. The plan backfired spectacularly. British consumers quickly realized that the stamp, made in Germany, was not a badge of inferiority, but a mark of superior quality and lower price. German trade accelerated. By 1900, Germany's share of global manufacturing output surpassed Britain's. Look at the cold, unyielding data. Between 1870 and 1913, German steel production exploded by an astounding 1,300%, reaching 17.3 million metric tons per year. Over that same period, British steel production grew sluggishly, stalling at just 7.5 million tons. Britain's industrial margins were collapsing, yet its sovereign debt obligations were compounding at compound interest rates. To offset these declining industrial yields, the British ruling class turned to speculative financial leverage and sovereign debt expansion. They launched an unprecedented naval buildup, constructing massive, hyper-expensive dreadnought battleships. But these warships were not built merely for defense. They were funded by immense issues of government bonds, designed to absorb excess bank liquidity and stimulate domestic heavy industry. Germany, trapped in the same structural loop, matched Britain ship for ship, funding its own naval expansion through massive debt issues underwritten by the Reichsbank and private Berlin syndicates. By 1910, both empires were spending over 40% of their national budgets purely servicing military debt and maintaining naval armaments. Behind the grand rhetoric of national pride lay a desperate, balance sheet reality. Both nations were running massive fiscal deficits to fund a competitive arms race that neither could afford. When trade routes closed to goods, they eventually opened to artillery. The true flashpoint of 1914 was never Sarajevo. It was a line of steel intended to bypass the British maritime tax collector. To understand why the global financial elite required a total war, you must look east toward the decaying carcass of the Ottoman Empire. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman state was bankrupt. To secure its debts, European creditors had established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, in 1881, an extraordinary institution that literally seized control of Ottoman state revenues, collecting taxes directly from local populations to pay off British, French, and German bondholders. It was corporate colonialism disguised as sovereign debt management. But in the late 1890s, Deutsche Bank executed a financial maneuver that sent shockwaves through the city of London. They secured a concession from the Sultan to build the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. This railway was an economic masterstroke. It promised to connect Central Europe directly to the oil fields of Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf via an overland route. Why did this terrify London and Paris? Because an overland trade route bypassed the Suez Canal entirely, a canal owned and monetized by British and French capital. More importantly, it allowed German industrial goods and military forces to reach the Indian Ocean without ever passing a British naval checkpoint or paying a single British customs duty. It threatened to unlock vast, untapped agricultural and petroleum assets, giving Germany an independent, self-sustaining economic bloc that could permanently survive outside the British gold and maritime monopoly. For 15 years, British and French financial institutions waged an aggressive campaign of monetary sabotage against the project. They refused to clear Deutsche Bank's railway bonds in London and Paris. They used the OPDA to block Ottoman tax revenues from backing the construction loans. They funded proxy conflicts in the Balkans to destabilize the land corridors through which the tracks were being laid. By 1912, the financial system could no longer hold the weight of these irreconcilable debt burdens. Germany had poured hundreds of millions of gold marks into the desert sand, and its banking system was leveraged to the hilt on the success of the line. Britain saw a direct, existential threat to its maritime trade empire and its global bond yields. The stage was set. The powder keg was not nationalist hatred in the Balkans, it was a battle over who would collect the rents on global trade routes and oil reserves. In Paris, millions of everyday retail investors held paper certificates that bound the blood of Russian peasants directly to French retirement pensions. Most people believe that France and Russia formed an alliance out of a shared fear of German military power. But here is the part they don't teach you in school. Russia in 1914 was not a military powerhouse. It was a bankrupt, agrarian state kept on monetary life support by French investment banks. Following its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and the near collapse of the Romanov dynasty during the 1905 revolution, the Russian imperial treasury was completely empty. St. Petersburg faced immediate sovereign default. Enter Paris. French banking syndicates, led by Crédit Lyonnais and the Banque de Paris, orchestrated the largest international sovereign loan in world history up to that point, the 1906 Russian loan, totaling 2.25 billion francs. French politicians marketed these Russian bonds to millions of middle-class French citizens as a risk-free, high-yield investment. Retail investors poured their life savings into these certificates, creating a massive political constituency in France whose financial survival depended entirely on the solvency of the Russian Tsar. But French banks did not grant these loans out of financial charity. Attached to the credit agreements were ruthless, non-negotiable legal covenants. France demanded that Russia allocate a massive portion of the borrowed gold directly into military expenditures. Specifically, Russia was legally obligated to build strategic railway networks running directly from its interior toward the German border, railways designed for the rapid mobilization of millions of troops. If Russia failed to build these strategic military lines, French banks threatened to pull the plug on Russian credit, plunging the Russian state into immediate default and social revolution. What historians get wrong is assuming Russia mobilized its army in July 1914 out of Slavic brotherhood to defend Serbia. The cold, unvarnished truth is that St. Petersburg mobilized because French banks held the trigger to Russia's financial solvency. If Russia sat idle while Germany and Austria consolidated power in the Balkans, the entire French loan apparatus would collapse, liquidating the Russian state and destroying the life savings of the French middle class. By 1914, the entire continent had built a financial doomsday machine. Interlocking sovereign debts, backed by military covenants, meant that a credit default anywhere in the system would instantly trigger a total military response everywhere else. Forget the diplomatic cables, look at the central bank balance sheets during the final week of July 1914. While ambassadors were exchanging polite letters in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, a silent, catastrophic panic was tearing through the global financial plumbing. On July 24, 1914, Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum to Serbia. But behind closed doors, international merchant banks and bill brokers in London and Paris didn't wait for diplomatic responses. They began liquidating their portfolios at any price. Under the gold standard, international trade relied on bills of exchange, short-term paper debt instruments backed by private banks. In the final week of July, international bill brokers suddenly stopped accepting German, Austrian, and Russian paper. The global credit market completely seized up. Visual note: graphics showing the rapid drain of gold reserves from European central banks toward the United States between July 24 and July 31, 1914. A massive capital flight began. Foreign investors rushed to sell their European stocks and bonds, converting paper currency into physical gold and wiring it out of Europe to the safety of New York banks. Look at the timeline of financial panic versus political mobilization. July 27th. The Vienna Stock Exchange crashes and closes. Panic spreads to Berlin, where commercial banks suffer massive gold runs as citizens queue around the block to liquidate paper marks into physical coin. July 28th. Austria declares war on Serbia. The Reichsbank loses 10% of its gold reserves in a single day. July 29th. The Paris Bourse experiences total liquidity collapse. French investors demand immediate gold conversion for their Russian bonds. July 30th. Russia orders full mobilization. The Bank of England's gold reserves drop to dangerously low levels, threatening systemic default. July 31st. The London Stock Exchange shuts down to prevent the total liquidation of British capital assets. Do you see the sequence? The banking system did not collapse because of the war. The war was declared because the banking system had already collapsed. European treasuries and central banks faced an impossible choice: allow systemic, cascading defaults across every major bank and sovereign balance sheet, or declare war. Declaring war provided the ultimate legal exit mechanism: force majeure. By declaring a state of national emergency, governments could legally suspend the gold standard, declare debt moratoriums, freeze civilian bank withdrawals, and force central banks to print unbacked paper money to monetize government debts. War was not a tragic failure of diplomacy. It was a deliberate, synchronized reset button pressed by central banks facing instant liquidation. As millions marched to the front lines line by line, governments systematically seized civilian wealth to clear pre-war balance sheets. The moment war was declared in August 1914, the monetary rules that had governed the 19th century were unceremoniously dumped into the trash bin of history. Across Europe, governments suspended specie payments, making it illegal for citizens to redeem paper currency for physical gold. Then came the grandest wealth transfer in human history up to that point. Governments launched massive war bond drives, appealing to patriotism to strip civilians of their private savings. In Germany, the government urged citizens to hand over their gold jewelry, rings, and tooth fillings in exchange for paper marks, under the slogan, "Gold gab ich für Eisen, I gave gold for iron." Millions of ordinary working-class families handed over their tangible, real wealth. In return, they received pieces of paper backed by bankrupt governments that promised to repay them after total victory was achieved. Behind this patriotic fervor lay a cold financial reality: inflation was being weaponized as a stealth tax. Unable to fund the war through traditional taxation, central banks turned on the printing presses. The Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and the Banque de France printed trillions of unbacked fiat paper notes to pay armaments cartels, while the purchasing power of the working class was systematically decimated. While European populations bled in the trenches of the Somme and Verdun, the global center of financial power quietly migrated across the Atlantic. Because European industrial capacity was focused entirely on war production, European nations had to import massive quantities of food, steel, and munitions from the United States. But American manufacturers did not accept paper marks or promises. They demanded payment in gold or hard collateral. Britain and France rapidly drained their gold reserves to pay American suppliers. When the gold ran dry, they were forced to liquidate their vast foreign investments, selling off American railroads, mines, and real estate at fire sale prices. Who managed this colossal fire sale of European assets? A single private institution on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan and Company. J.P. Morgan was appointed as the sole purchasing agent for the British and French governments in the United States. By 1916, J.P. Morgan had organized a $500 million credit facility for the Allies, single-handedly underwriting the Allied war effort while positioning Wall Street to become the new, undisputed landlord of global capital. The old European monetary elite had bought themselves time, but the monster they unleashed was rapidly consuming them. The ultimate tragedy of 1914 is that the global monetary elite sacrificed 50 million lives to save a system that burned to the ground anyway. They believed a short, violent war would clear the debt overhang, reset trade balances, crush foreign industrial competitors, and allow them to restore the classical gold standard hegemony under their own terms. They were disastrously, catastrophically wrong. By 1918, the four great imperial structures that had dominated world finance, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Imperial Russia, and the German Empire, lay in complete ruins. Their central banks were destroyed, their currencies were rendered worthless, and their sovereign debt was permanently repudiated. Consider the tragic irony of the outcomes. Imperial Russia, the Tsar's regime mobilized to protect French loans and preserve its credit rating. The resulting economic collapse triggered the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, leading to the execution of the Romanov family, the total liquidation of private property, and the complete repudiation of every single French bond. Millions of middle-class French retail investors lost their entire life savings in a single stroke. Great Britain won the war on paper, but emerged from the conflict financially crippled. The nation that entered 1914 as the world's greatest creditor emerged in 1918 as a desperate debtor, owing billions to Wall Street. The Bank of England's monetary monopoly was broken forever, its empire terminally weakened, and its currency perpetually debased. Germany. The imperial government spent 160 billion marks on the war, funding 87% of it through debt and paper currency creation. The resulting debt stack led directly to the catastrophic Weimar hyperinflation of 1923, destroying the German middle class, obliterating social trust, and creating the precise economic vacuum that enabled the rise of totalitarianism. The monetary system designed to maintain imperial stability became the ultimate engine of imperial destruction. And those who designed it were ultimately consumed by the very forces they unleashed. If this story feels unnerving, it's because you are living through its second act right now. Once you understand the hidden monetary machinery of 1914, you can see the exact same structural patterns repeating across the modern geopolitical landscape today. The variables have changed, but the underlying mathematical equations remain identical. Look at the modern macroeconomic landscape through the cold lens of history. Unpayable sovereign debt stacks. Global debt levels today have surpassed 330% of global GDP, higher than they were on the eve of World War I. Major Western economies are trapped in a fiscal death spiral, spending trillions of dollars just to service interest payments on unpayable national debts. Weaponized trade and tariffs. Just as in the 1890s, the era of open global trade is ending. Nations are erecting aggressive tariff walls, launching trade wars, and fragmenting into regional economic blocs to protect domestic industries from foreign competitors. Monetary hegemony battles. Just as Britain fought to crush the Berlin to Baghdad railway to protect its maritime tax collection, we are today witnessing a desperate conflict over global payment clearing rails. The weaponization of the US dollar, SWIFT blockades, and cross-border currency clearing networks is forcing emerging powers to build alternative financial systems to bypass Western financial control. The central bank corner. Modern central banks are trapped in a corner where they can no longer raise interest rates without triggering systemic sovereign defaults, nor lower them without triggering catastrophic inflation and currency destruction. The truth is far darker than you imagine. When sovereign debt becomes unpayable, and central banks run out of monetary tricks, history offers only one exit mechanism to reset the balance sheet without explicitly defaulting on domestic populations. War. The math hasn't changed. Only the weapons have. History gives us one immutable economic law. When states must choose between honoring balance sheets or blowing them up, they choose the bomb every single time. War is not an interruption of the economic system. It is the ultimate, violent extension of a monetary system that has reached its mathematical limits. It is the mechanism by which governments liquidate domestic liabilities, mask systemic central bank failures, confiscate private wealth under the banner of national security, and redirect public anger away from corrupt financial elites toward a foreign enemy. In 1914, millions of innocent young men marched into the muddy trenches of Europe believing they were fighting for God, king, and country. They died believing their sacrifices were noble, tragic necessities of geopolitics. They never knew that their lives were used as collateral to settle unpaid bills on European bank ledgers, to preserve declining trade monopolies, and to protect central bank liquidity. Now that you see the hidden machinery behind the history books, you can never unsee it. The next time you hear politicians banging the drums of war, talking about defending democracy, honoring alliances, or protecting national pride, don't listen to their words. Look at the central bank balance sheets. Look at the sovereign debt stacks. Look at who holds the debt, and who stands to be liquidated if the system defaults. Because those who do not understand the cold mechanics of capital are doomed to be consumed by them. Most people will scroll past this analysis and go back to sleep, believing the comfortable textbook fairy tales of Serbian assassins and tragic miscalculations. They will continue to believe that war is just a political mistake, rather than a financial strategy. If you made it this far, you are part of the rare 1% who crave actual structural truth over comforting fables. If you understand the message of this script, drop a #DeadIsWar in the comments below right now. It signals to the algorithm that this content needs to reach those who are ready for it. I want to leave you with one final, provocative question to debate in the comments. Do you believe modern central banks will trigger another global kinetic conflict to liquidate our current $300 trillion debt crisis, or will technological innovation break the cycle before the balance sheets collapse? Drop your thesis below. I read and reply to the sharpest takes in the community. If you want to understand how money, history, and power actually work, before the next reset happens, hit the subscribe button and join our community of economic history skeptics.